Good morning, and welcome to our online class, California's Title 24 Energy Code, What, Why, and Where It's Going. My name is Margie O'Driscoll, and I am the competition organizer for the Architecture at Zero competition. This competition focuses on decarbonization, resilience, and equity. This year, the challenge is to design a teaching and innovation farm lab connecting the history of California's first Black town, Allensworth, to its present aspiration to become a destination for sustainable agriculture. All entrants will design a teaching and innovation farm lab. Graduate students and professionals will also design housing for farming students on the site. Details about the competition can be found at architectureatzero.com. Key aspects of this project include responding to the challenges of equity and resilience through the design solution. The competition is open to students and professionals based anywhere in the world. Up to $25,000 will be awarded to student and professional winners. The deadline for entries is June 15th. The competition is sponsored by 4 California utilities: SCE, SDGE, SoCalGas, and PG&E. Thank you for your support. We are also grateful for the support of our co-sponsors, the California Energy Commission, AIA California, AIA Students, IBPSA, and USGBC Central Coast. Today's class will provide guidance for entrants and guests about California's energy code. This code is one of the most stringent building energy codes in the country. Understanding and correctly applying these standards is necessary to ensure the state's energy and ambitious environmental goals are achieved. You don't have to enter the competition to join us today, but we sure hope you do. This class is sponsored by SCE, and we are most grateful for their support. Today's class is led by the amazing Brian Selby. Brian is a principal at Selby Energy, Inc., where his primary role is developing and delivering energy code training classes. He's an energy code subject matter expert, and he interacts frequently with the California Energy Commission, association professionals, and other industry stakeholders to foster education, promotion, and compliance with California's building energy efficiency standards. Some details about this webinar. This course will be recorded and available online at the Architecture at Zero website and also at SCE very soon. We welcome questions from the audience. Please feel free to use the Q&A box in your chat. Also, a PDF copy of this presentation will be sent to all participants. With that, I'd like to welcome Brian to get us started. Brian, so happy to have you here.
Thank you, Margie. What a great introduction. I appreciate that. I know about amazing, but I will do my best to share all this wonderful information about our energy code here. And thank you all for logging in this morning. Got a lot of information to cover, as Margie said. Really like to keep this as conversational as possible. So if you have any questions, I welcome those questions. I'll do my best to answer those on the fly. Just wanted to share a little bit about myself, just to give you an idea of what type of background I have. My background is in residential design. I've designed homes for decades. I know I probably don't look as old as I am, but I got started with the energy code compliance back in the mid 1980s, about 1985. This wasn't by my choice. Our local jurisdiction just started enforcing the energy code in the area that I was designing about that time. And either by luck or happenstance, I don't know what, I was designated the person that was going to be doing a lot of these calculations to demonstrate compliance for our energy code. So lo and behold, after decades of doing that, our energy code is among the most stringent in the country. We have very, ambitious energy and carbon emission savings goals. So that said, I'm also a certified energy analyst through the California Association of Building Energy Consultants, or KBEC, you might know it as. Also the current board president of KBEC. And I am also a HERS rater. So got a lot of background in energy efficiency and code. My primary role these days is teaching energy code compliance to folks like yourselves, architects, designers, builders, energy consultants, teach modeling classes using the performance software that's approved by the Energy Commission. So lots of background. I'm happy to take questions as they come up here in this presentation. A couple of our goals today. I want to make sure that you have a good grounding or understanding of the history, intent, and benefits behind our energy code here in California. And when I say energy code, I say that that's the accepted definition of our code. It's also referred to as Title 24 Part 6 or Title 24 Part 6 Building Energy Efficiency Standards. So all those terms are interchangeable, so essentially meaning the same thing. So we're going to cover that history, intent, and benefits, as well as how our energy code has evolved over the years. Since its inception in 1978, we've seen many different changes along the way. So we'll cover some of that. Going to talk specifically about the structure and organization of the code. So it's good to have an understanding of how to find information, find regulations that apply to your project. So there's a very systematic format that we'll cover. And we'll also talk about how the compliance process works. What stages are certain requirements documented? So we're going to be covering the energy code, how it applies to residential dwellings. So single family up to multifamily. So we've had a recent change in our code that really emphasized requirements for multifamily buildings. So we're still lumping those together, but we'll show you in the code where those various occupancies apply. And then lastly, we want to share some valuable resources that you might be using in your design competition here to help understand and apply some of these regulations. So we've got lots of resources available through Energy Code ACE. So good. Well, let's not hold back here. We'll just jump right into the history here. I've got some bullet points, and this information may be something that you're aware of, or maybe not. So let's dive in here. So back in 1973, not sure how many of you were around back then. I know I was a young kid back in 73. I do remember my parents, waiting in long lines to get gas. And that was all based on an oil embargo through OPEC. And it was really a retaliation against the U.S. for supporting their adversaries. So, which did instigate, some legislation, specifically here in California, to reduce our dependency on foreign oil. Boy, have things come full circle these days, right? We're still working on some of those issues currently. So in 1974, our California legislature passed a bill called the Warren-Alquist Act, which did a number of things. First of all, it established the Energy Commission, the California Energy Commission, as an entity to regulate our energy usage in California, not just building energy usage, but transportation and whatnot, all the energy uses here. It also established that those standards must be cost effective, that they must be updated on a 3-year cycle. So every 3 years, we have to have more restrictive, more aggressive energy codes for multiple purposes. One, to save energy at peak usage times. Peak times is when our grid is at its capacity, meaning that we may not have enough power to go around to everybody who wants to turn on their lights or charge their cell phone. And if we do reduce that peak energy usage, we can avoid building new power plants, which are very expensive. So that's one of the primary focuses of the Energy Code. And additionally, to save energy overall, not just save it, but cost effectively develop standards that will reduce our energy usage and pay for themselves over the life cycle of that feature or system. So in 2003, California adopted the Energy Action Plan. A lot of these documents, you can go on the California Energy Commission's website and download these documents just to give you an idea of what's there. This was really the one of the guiding documents that really set California on another trajectory to take deeper cuts on energy usage and energy savings. 2006, our California Assembly passed AB 32. That was the Global Warming Solutions Act, adopted greenhouse gas emission requirements based on historical periods in time to reduce back to a time when we had less greenhouse gas emissions. 2008, our big bold strategies were adopted, again, taking another step towards not only reducing energy use, but our carbon emissions. So, and all these documents are all available, like I said earlier, through the Energy Commission's website. You can find those. So that's kind of a snapshot of some of the policies and goals that California has enacted to keep California a leader in energy efficiency and carbon reduction. So now the intent behind the code, serves several purposes. Since its inception back in '78, the primary focus has been on reducing the, some big words here, uneconomic, inefficient, or unnecessary consumption of energy. I love that little phrase there. We don't intend on wasting energy, but oftentimes due to not being regulated, not being aware of that energy use, it happens. So our energy code is focusing in on saving energy. Energy is a commodity. It is cheaper to reduce our usage than it is to build new power plants. So, and by doing so, we can have a more sustainable, more resilient grid that will carry us for a longer period of time. Another focus is on enhancing indoor air quality, or the environmental quality of that indoor environment. Really, that's not an energy savings measure, that's a life-saving measure. So in conjunction with saving energy, we want to make sure that as our buildings become more energy efficient, which in basic terms means that our buildings are tighter, right? Less air infiltration, air leakage. Well, what happens in those tight, controlled environments is contaminants can build up. So requiring ventilation to be met to dilute that indoor contaminants so that we can have a healthy indoor environment really has been one of the major focuses on current code iterations. So for 2022 and beyond, obviously we'll continue to focus in on energy efficiency, but there is a major change. Some of the goals set by those big bold strategies to achieve zero net energy consumption by 2020. That was our 2019 code. That was the code cycle prior to the beginning of this year. And for non-residential, we're seeing an accelerated adoption of zero net energy. The goal was by 2030. We're already at the threshold of zero net energy for our non-residential or commercial buildings. So now, above and beyond reducing energy usage that need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, our energy code just introduced brand new regulations, metrics for regulating carbon emissions. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get into some of the metrics behind meeting energy code requirements. So, but really this is allowing our state to take advantage of renewable energy and grid flexibility. When I talk about grid flexibility, I'm talking about battery storage. Everybody knows what PV or renewable energy is, right? That's creating power or energy that we can use in our homes and buildings, uh, typically through the sun, but it could be other means. But our energy code does recognize solar PV as a renewable energy source, but grid flexibility to allow the occupants or building owners to self-utilize that energy that they've generated from their PV system during those peak pricing periods. That's a load shifting or a flexibility measure that allows those occupants or owners to utilize that energy at those peak times rather than exporting that energy to the grid. If they're utilizing that energy, they're not drawing from the grid, and we have a much better or sustainable grid in that measure. So now some of the benefits of our energy code, I mean, these are self-evident, obviously. Um, we've talked about a few of these in the previous slides, but avoiding building new power plants, they're very expensive. There's a lot of regulatory requirements to build new power plants, and most of the new power plants that have been built in recent years are fuel-fired or peak plants. So they're not low emission plants. So if we can avoid that, we can not only keep our energy costs low, but we can also avoid those higher carbon emissions that would be embodied in that energy. So meet resource needs at lowest cost and least environmental impact. Again, if we can save energy, we can do that much more efficiently and economically than building new power plants. Increase building energy efficiency. That's a no-brainer. Contribute to the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals. Again, some of those legislative actions, AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, or other assembly bills and bills passed in the state to uphold our goals here. That bullet, enable pathways for all electric buildings. If that sounds like a no-brainer, in let me give some context to that. In recent years, in previous code iterations, we had an energy code that supported gas space heating and gas water heating, among other appliances that are used in our buildings. That was kind of divergent from our state's greenhouse gas and carbon emissions goals. So the 2019 code, or the previous code cycle, was the code cycle that started that pathway towards enabling all electric buildings and not penalizing the use of all electric appliances for space heating and for water heating. That has continued for our 2022 energy code, and in actuality have provided baselines. So the code is based on most of those energy usages being all electric rather than being dependent on a gas source. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So we talked about the demand flexibility and self-utilization of PV generation. Again, if we can have code or regulations that support that self-utilization of our energy, we have much more grid flexibility to handle the demand when it's 110 degrees out and everybody has their air conditioners on in the late afternoon during the summertime. So that's really the benefit there, and we're seeing our energy code really incentivize folks to not only put PV systems on. We have regulations that require that on most building types, but also incentivize the use of battery storage systems. So, and then lastly, our energy code does offer that option for local governments to adopt above code programs, ordinances. We call those reach codes. That's when a jurisdiction can go beyond what the energy code is. Our energy codes are minimum requirements. This is the bare minimum that you can build a home or a business to. And some of these REACH codes, through the approval of the Energy Commission, have got above code programs that require higher performing buildings. Now, we can see that our energy codes um, do serve a purpose, not just benefiting us as individuals. Excuse me. Excuse me. But we can see when we compare the per capita energy use, and this is electric energy use across the US, you can see that the intent or the benefit of our energy code has really paid off. Now, I can tell you that the demand for electricity has not gone down in California compared to the rest of the US. These are representing energy savings. I don't know about you, but these days there are more and more things that are plugged in our households and in our businesses. Phones and gadgets and computers and TVs, and the list goes on and on. So that is really there to prove that our demand has not gone down for electricity, but through our energy code, our regulations, the usage of our electric appliances and systems has maintained a fairly level trajectory over the years that we've had energy codes in place here in California. You can see that the U.S. has kind of tapered off. The remaining states in the U.S. has tapered off, but by far, California has made some major advancements and is really leading the U.S. in energy efficiency. Not to say that some other codes may have some more stringent requirements, but by and large, overall, the requirements that apply to all buildings in California are much more stringent than anywhere else in the states. So. Good. Please let me know if you have any questions. You're welcome to type those in the chat window. I kind of have an eyeball here on the chat window if you have anything. So please let me know if you do. Now, here's a list or a kind of a summary of all of the building codes that apply to our buildings here in California. You can see that Part 1, administrative code, all the way down to Part 11, which is our green building code. Part 6 falls right in between there. So when folks say, are you compliant with Title 24? Often people refer to Title 24 as our energy code, but it is only one part of many building codes that we have here in California. We're seeing through the increase of requirements, stringency of our energy code, the increase of cost of electricity and other fuel types, we're seeing our energy code become more enforced among jurisdictions. We're seeing more activity or more awareness of our energy efficiency and carbon emissions within our buildings. So this is a good trend. It's not necessarily number 6 in ranking. It probably falls a little lower than that in enforceability, but we're seeing a trend towards more building departments are aware and have become more knowledgeable about our energy codes, and that in turn really represents more enforcement of our energy code. So I want to give a snapshot of our building codes just so you have an understanding of where our energy code falls in relationship to the other codes here in California. So now the structure of our energy code has changed. Our 2022 energy code introduced some brand new chapters, subchapters 10, 11, and 12. You can see there in my list there that those new chapters represent multifamily buildings. This is kind of a new step in of clarifying some of the issues regarding our multifamily buildings as opposed to single family buildings and non-residential buildings, where under the 2019 code, multifamily buildings that were 3 stories and less were found with the residential subchapters 7, 8, and 9. So single family all the way through multifamily 3 stories and less. Multifamily buildings that were 4 stories and more often referred to as high-rise residential buildings, were found in subchapters 3 through 6 that are associated with our non-residential buildings and hotel motel occupancy. So we had a disconnect with our energy code. You had to go through one portion of code for a certain building type, 4-story and more, or high-rise res, and another portion of code for those other multifamily building types, 3-story and less, or low-rise multifamily. So we have brand new chapters here. So really, this is just to kind of clarify that that was a major shift in our organization of code. So now subchapters 7 through 9 only apply to single-family residential, where and subchapters 10 through 12 are specifically for multifamily. So a lot of the code that was in subchapters 3 through 6 and subchapters 7 through 9 have been put together to apply those to the specific requirements of multifamily buildings. So significant change with the structure of our energy code. Now, if you're not aware of the organization of our energy code, there's a great table of contents. I call it a table of contents. It kind of operates or functions like a table of contents. This is table 100.0A. If you're new to the energy code or want to get a better understanding of where certain requirements are and how those requirements apply to various occupancies, this is your go-to document. In fact, if you use the reference ACE through Energy Code ACE, this is hyperlinked. You could actually go to a particular section of code and click on it from this table, and it'll take you right to that section of code. So this is really just a roadmap to find where in the code certain requirements apply. You can see we have mandatory requirements, prescriptive requirements, those requirements that apply when using the performance approach, and requirements that apply to specifically additions and alterations. And these cover the entire context of our energy code based on the occupancy type and the application of the code. So occupancies include non-residential and hotel motel occupancies. We have all of our single family requirements as well as our multifamily requirements. And those are further broken down into the application. General requirements, envelope requirements, those surfaces of our buildings, walls, ceiling, floors, windows, and doors that really are meant to reduce heat transfer between our indoor environment, our conditioned environment, and the outdoor environment. And then all the other systems, lighting, water heating, mechanical systems, even pool and spa equipment are regulated by our energy code. So good table to reference if you're going to start somewhere. That I highly recommend going to this table to get a better idea of the structure and organization of our energy code. Now, I mentioned in the previous slide that our energy code regulates various occupancies. Now, these occupancies are based on what Title 24 Part 2 define these occupancies as. So you can see here the occupancy groups that are covered by our energy code. Pretty much all buildings. There's a few occupancies that are not covered. You can see some of the new occupancies that have been included in our energy code are the I occupancies. These are our institutional buildings. So these are just limited to I1 and I2, which are convalescent homes, board and care facilities, hospitals, and so forth. By and large, a lot of the requirements regarding controls for lighting, controls for mechanical equipment are exempt for those healthcare facilities for obvious reasons, health safety reasons. We don't want lights turning off automatically in surgery centers. That's probably not good for the doctor operating or the patient, right? So these are pretty obvious, but these requirements apply based on the occupancy type, and we have certain requirements that vary. So now, in addition to separating buildings by occupancy type, we also separate requirements for buildings based on the climate zone. We have a very diverse climate diverse number of climates here in California. These are all represented by the climate zone number. Climate zone 1, you can see, is the northwest coast of California, that often referred to as the uh, Eureka area. If anybody's been up there, it's not a warm climate. It's a rather cool climate. In certain situations, you might even have a call for heating in buildings during the summertime. So very little cooling in there, that particular climate zone, as opposed to, let's say, climate zone 14 or 15, which is down in the desert area, kind of the southeastern portion of California. So two extremes there, representing the very cold um, climate zone 1, and very hot, arid climate zone. So you can see where our energy code, if we had just one requirement for every building in California, we can't really meet all the energy saving needs based on the geographic location of that project. So uh, having a very diverse climate um, requirements, specific requirements for buildings based on their climate zone, allows us to tailor those requirements based on what is the most energy efficient for buildings built in those specific areas. And in some of those examples I gave earlier, like climate zone 1, there's not a lot of call for cooling in that climate zone. So cooling dependent measures aren't cost effective. So a cool roof in climate zone 1 wouldn't be something that you would do, but you would, um, have other features that would reduce the amount of heat transfer during the winter time, or containing that conditioned air inside the building. So anyways, the 16 climate zones, we kind of break those down into three primary groups. We have our hot inland and desert climate zones, primarily representing climate zones 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. We do have a few in the Southern California region. Climate zones 10 there, 8, 9, and 10 are kind of on the border of those hot inland climate zones. We have our moderate coastal climate zones. Those are our single digit zones, 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7. Those all are California coast climate zones. And then we have our cold, high altitude mountain climate zone 16, which is a fairly large climate zone, but probably the least populated climate zone out of all 16 of these. So good. Now, as far as our energy code requirements are concerned, we do have options for demonstrating compliance for our buildings. Now, mandatory measures, if they apply to your project, must always be met. And that really rings true with the name. If it's mandatory and it applies to your project, that must be done. You can't trade these off. You can't performance your way out of mandatory requirements. They just need to be met. And generally, mandatory requirements are determined to be cost effective in all climate zones. We've seen a few exceptions to some mandatory requirements that are specific for certain climate zones, but generally speaking, mandatory measures are measures that are cost effective. They save energy in almost any situation. So these focus primarily on minimum efficiency requirements of our appliances, so heating and cooling equipment, as well as water heating equipment and any other appliance that could be plugged in our buildings. Distribution systems of those heating cooling systems, minimum insulation requirements for ducts, air sealing and testing for duct air distribution. We've got mandatory requirements that address health and safety needs, like whole dwelling unit ventilation requirements. Again, those aren't energy efficiency measures. Those are life-saving measures that apply to all buildings. We have requirements that concentrate on air infiltration, reducing the amount of unwanted air that's traveling through our buildings, lighting requirements, lighting control requirements, minimum insulation level. So you can kind of see the pattern here that these requirements are in place to ensure as a backstop that our buildings are built to certain standards. Now, once those mandatory measures are met, there are two approaches that you can use to demonstrate compliance with our energy code. On the left-hand side, we have our prescriptive approach, and it's just that. There's a prescribed features list based on the climate zone that your project is located in. This is a very simple but uh, uh, you know easy or inflexible way to comply with our code. You go to the prescriptive requirements, and all of the features that are listed for your climate zone must be met or exceeded. Um, and if you do that, then the project automatically complies. Still needs to provide the documentation to do that. But if you follow the prescribed energy features list, then your project meets our energy code. Very inflexible. There's not a lot of opportunity um, to trade off or provide some design flexibility. That's why we have a performance approach, and what that does is allows the designer to test various ideas or concepts for providing efficiency to that building. So you can trade off certain features for other requirements, as long as the proposed building uses equal to or less energy than what the baseline is or what you're allowed to use. Now that baseline or the allowed energy usage is based on those prescriptive requirements. So there is a connection between using the performance approach and the prescriptive approach. So the prescriptive approach, by and large, sets the baseline for energy usage. And when using the performance approach, that proposed building, as long as you haven't violated or avoided any of those mandatory requirements, as long as the proposed building uses equal to or less energy than what they're allowed to use, the project complies. And the delta, the difference between the proposed design and the standard design is represents the magnitude of energy savings or above code requirements. So we'll get into a little bit more about the performance approach here. We'll give you some examples of what the prescriptive approach looks like as well. So here is the table 150.1a. This is the list of requirements, the prescriptive requirements that apply for single family dwellings. You can see across the top of the table, we have all 16 climate zones. And on the vertical axis here, we have all the different regulated building features. Starts with the envelope features, roofs and ceilings. You can see we have a little bit of flexibility within our prescriptive approach. Option B or option C, these all mean different things depending on how the designer would like to handle some of these features. So you can see also here that certain requirements apply to certain climate zones and not others. So you can see with the below roof deck insulation requirement for high performance attics, some of the hotter climate zones 4 and 8 through 16 have below roof deck insulation requirements, where climate zones 1 through 3 and 5 through 7 do not. But alternatively, they have radiant barrier requirements in most of those climate zones. So that's how the prescriptive approach is used. You can see it goes through roof ceilings, walls, floors, talks about the quality of insulation installation. It's a HERS verified measure, QII. Roofing products, talking about cool roofs, fenestration, windows, glazed doors, skylights, so forth, doors, and goes on through our space conditioning and water heating systems. Now, we have a very similar table for our multifamily buildings. Now, this particular table is kind of a hybrid from the 2019 code. As I mentioned earlier, our energy code has dedicated chapters now for multifamily buildings, where some of those buildings, those 4-story or more high-rise residential buildings that were found in those subchapters 3 through 7, had certain requirements, and those buildings that were low-rise residential, 3-story and less, had other requirements in different chapters. Here's where we're seeing kind of all that information coming together into one requirement. So some of those requirements that applied to only high-rise residential now also apply to low-rise residential, and vice versa. So we're seeing a very flexible energy code, and the inclusion of those new chapters made this all possible. So again, the same principle applies. Find the requirements that apply to your project based on the climate zone. And if you comply prescriptively, you would need to meet all of the applicable requirements for that climate zone in order for a project to be compliant. Otherwise, you would have to use the performance approach. So it's one or the other. In some cases, with some buildings, you can utilize both prescriptive and performance. But for single family and low-rise multifamily, it's one or the other. You can't use a combination of both. But for high-rise residential and hotel motel, or I should say, for mixed use multifamily and non-residential and hotel motel, those can be done in a combination of prescriptive and performance. And what I mean by that is someone, a designer or energy consultant, may choose to do performance for, let's say, envelope and for lighting, indoor lighting, and choose to do mechanical systems prescriptively. And that's perfectly allowed with certain occupancy types, just not allowed for single family or for multifamily, 3-story and less. So again, let me know if you have any questions. I don't see any questions coming up in the chat here, but please let me know if you have any questions, or if you want to raise your hand. Happy to address those. Now, I talked about the metrics used for compliance when using the performance approach, and how our energy code has evolved over the years. So 2016 code and earlier, anyone using the performance approach, regardless of whether that project was new construction, an addition, or alteration, if you use the performance approach, the metric to determine whether or not the project was compliant was used in time-dependent valuation. So you can see the definition down there, kind of grayed out of the middle of the screen. Time-dependent valuation is a energy metric that looks at the cost of energy at certain times of the year in certain geographic locations throughout California, and considering the peak energy usage. So energy used in a hot climate zone, let's say the Central Valley here in California or in the desert, is more expensive in the summertime in the late afternoon. Those are typically our peak pricing periods of the class. So those TDV values, or the multipliers, value energy higher during those times as a way to incentivize reducing that energy usage. Now, when the 2019 code came out, they introduced two metrics, the EDR-E, or efficiency EDR rating, and EDR-T, total. Now, let me explain what those are. The efficiency EDR is a way to express the energy units used in a way that could be compared to other similar buildings or other buildings in other locations. They might be in different climate zones. It's equivalent to the miles per gallon sticker on a car, right? A way to evaluate our energy usage in buildings. So the EDR-E, or the efficiency EDR metric, really focuses in on the building energy efficiency, whereas the EDR-T, the total, takes into account the renewable energy, so solar PV or any other flexibility measure like a battery storage system, subtracts that from the efficiency to give a total EDR metric. So both metrics for the 2019 code for residential new construction would have to be met. So both the proposed design for the efficiency EDR and total EDR need to be equal to or less than the standard design for both of those metrics for a project to comply. Now, additions and alterations, we're still allowed to use the time-dependent valuation, still a really viable metric to be used there. But for new construction, focusing in on those requirements of having a PV system and the ability, the flexibility of utilizing a battery storage system or another flexibility measure to offset the amount of energy that you're consuming in that building to represent what that total impact is for that building on an annual basis. Now, for the 2022 code, we saw another metric that was introduced. Now, this is the EDRS, or Source Energy Design Rating. You can see at the bottom there. I don't have it grayed out. This is another metric that must be met that really establishes a proxy, a carbon proxy for carbon emissions. And in introducing this new metric, there were also changes to the energy code, the prescriptive requirements that required electric space heating. So primarily, when I say electric, all electric buildings, what we really mean are heat pumps, right? We don't want electric resistance heating, but our prescriptive requirements set certain climate zones to have a heat pump space heating baseline and a certain, well, all 16 climate zones have a heat pump water heating baseline. So that really establishes the carbon emissions, or at least the expectation of reducing carbon emissions in our buildings. So, for example, if somebody were to specify a gas tankless water heater on a project, new construction project, it would be penalized for higher carbon emissions. And if you wanted to keep that gas tankless water heater, you would have to do something that would offset those carbon emissions equal to the difference between a gas tankless water heater and the baseline heat pump water heater. So this is really, moving our buildings towards all electric, or incentivizing buildings to become all electric here in California. And this metric applies to all residential, single family, and multifamily buildings 3 stories and less. Now, there are similar metrics for our non-residential buildings and our high-rise residential and mixed occupancy buildings. But in this context and the performance approach, these 3 metrics really apply to just those residential buildings I mentioned. So. Good. Not sure if there's a question. It says in the housing classification for the competition, multifamily or hotel motel. That's a good question. Margie gave me a little bit of background about the competition being more temporary housing. It would be regulated under our energy code, and really depending on the configuration, could be considered single family residential if it was 2 attached dwelling units or fewer. And if they were more than 2 attached dwelling units, it would be considered a multifamily dwelling, or similar to a dormitory for colleges or education dormitories. So yeah, it would be considered residential. Good question though. All right, a little bit of more detail on our EDR metrics and how those apply and what features in our buildings are regulated under each of these metrics. You can see our source EDR, that's our carbon metric. It's a score representing the building's energy efficiency in terms of hourly source carbon. Now, there are, when we talk about source carbon, we're not just talking about the source coming from the utility. There is a fair bit of carbon, embodied carbon, in the generation of electricity from the utility. There is also some source carbon based on the fuel type chosen by the builder or occupant or building owner. So both of those are regulated under this requirement. So even if you have an all electric building, well, guess what? You still are um, uh, I don't know what the term is, but using a carbon-based energy unit. So until our utilities, which are regulated and have a goal to be, I think, and maybe Long, you can help me. I'm not really familiar with some of the generation, but I know the utilities are required to have a renewable portfolio by a certain date and time. So really that's regulated by our Public Utilities Commission. So you can see all of the features, the energy use is regulated under all the same features as our efficiency regulations. So the performance of the envelope, taking in consideration the indoor air quality or IAQ fan energy use, HVAC systems. So both heating, ventilation, and air conditioning are included in that, domestic hot water, as well as some of the what we call unregulated loads. It doesn't mean that they're not regulated, but when using the performance approach, you don't have a choice to include or exclude some of these loads. They are baseline loads, plug loads, lighting loads, other appliances that are used within the building. Those are all regulated by either Title 24 Part 6 or our energy efficiency or appliance efficiency regulations. So those are all taken into consideration. Now, moving to our efficiency EDR metric, again, that's representing the overall building efficiency. Same features, same energy end uses are considered for that metric, all based in time-dependent valuation. So envelope, IAQ, HVAC, DHW, and those other loads that we're talking about. Now, our total EDR metric, this has changed slightly from the 2019 code where it used to be simple math, right? You could take your efficiency EDR score, subtract your PV and flexibility score, and that would equal your total EDR. This is a little bit different now. It's more or less a weighted average, considering other um, measures. So the total EDR represents the total efficiency of the building after factoring in those PV systems or renewable energy generation and the flexibility measures. So those flexibility measures include battery storage systems as well as for residential, a pre-cooling strategy where a thermostat would disable the cooling system during those peak pricing periods. But prior to that, it would pre-cool the home to a temperature set point, either 4 degrees or greater or less than what is normally set, and then turn the system off so it can coast through the those peak pricing periods. So now, for a building to comply under the 2022 code, all three of these metrics must be met. And I'll give you an example here. This is from the CBEC Res software. It's one of the approved. Actually, it's the state's public domain performance software for single-family homes. We can see what our proposed and standard design requirements are. Metrics are for each of these three compliance metrics: source EDR, efficiency EDR, and total EDR. Where the proposed design, that's the number on the bottom, sorry, needs to be equal to or less than the number on the top. So moving over to the right, these are the margins, basically the math. You subtract the proposed design from the standard design, and it'll tell you what the delta or the difference is. And if any of these numbers are negative, the project doesn't comply. So all three of these metrics must be met for a new construction project to comply under the 2022 standards. So good. It's like we have a comment. The good news is that with CCAs, power generation is cleaner than before. I agree with that. Yeah, there are a lot of the CCAs that have 100% renewable energy. Although the greater number of ratepayers in California are supported by the investor and utility. So we're seeing a trend towards all electric generation. So I know that we're heading that direction with the CCAs, but I'm sure soon we'll have more of the utilities on board with the 100% renewable. So yeah, great comment though. Now, I want to tackle the what's new for single family at a very high level here. Not going to get into a lot of detail, but we just went through the brand new performance metric. So the new metric that was added for single family was that source EDR metric, really incentivizing homes to be built to all electric requirements. In fact, we're seeing some mandatory requirements to provide the provisions to going all electric in the future if a gas appliance was installed. So also along with that new metric, I mentioned this in the previous slides, that there are new prescriptive heat pump space heating and domestic hot water requirements based on the climate zone. Again, going back to the performance approach versus prescriptive, if the prescriptive requirement sets the baseline and the baseline for water heating is a heat pump water heater, then using the performance approach, you're going to be penalized for using a gas water heater. So just want to put that, reiterate that that's how our performance approach works. Third bullet there, we have brand new electric ready requirements. That means if you choose to install a gas space heater, whether that's central or individual, a gas cooktop or a gas dryer, then the electric wiring and the reserve breaker space in the panel needs to be reserved and the wiring installed for the future installation of that electric appliance. This really paves the way for homeowners, occupants to move to an all electric strategy in the future cost effectively without having to rewire. Now, in addition to that, there are new mandatory battery ready requirements for all new construction. So if you're building a new home or a newly constructed ADU, those battery requirements would need to be in place, meaning that the provisions for the future installation of a battery, including the interconnection, some pre-wiring, reserve breaker space, minimum panel size, needs to be met regardless of whether you're choosing to install a battery or not. Again, making it more cost effective for the future installation of that battery storage system. We've got new re-roof requirements requiring not only cool roofing products to lower the heat transfer into our roofing systems, but also requirements to add roof deck insulation to our buildings to reduce, again, further the amount of heat transfer into attic spaces, which translate into hotter temperatures of attics, which makes it really tough for buildings with HVAC distribution ducts located in that attic to perform well, as well as the heat transfers that occurs into our building. So we want to really reduce that and lower the cooling demand. We have new HVAC alteration requirements. We're seeing lower thresholds to trigger various HERS verification inspection requirements, as well as some measures that go into triggering envelope requirements, higher insulation requirements based on the alteration of an HVAC system. So, and lastly, there we have some indoor air quality requirements where our code now addresses kitchen hood exhaust fan requirements based on the square footage of the building and the type of fuel that's used for the cooktops. You can imagine a gas cooktop is going to have higher emissions than an electric cooktop. So, and therefore those hoods need to move higher amounts of air or capture more of that, the gases that are coming from that cooktop. So good. Now it's what's new for multifamily. Again, we've got brand new chapters in our in our energy code, the subchapters 10, 11, 12. Those again are specifically for multifamily buildings where they were in various sections of the code prior to this code cycle. We've got new forms that are specifically designed for our multifamily buildings that are 3 stories and less. Those are the LMCC, or low-rise multifamily certificate of, I can't talk, certificate of compliance. So again, those are brand new forms to cater to that specific building type. We've got brand new software. So for the performance approach, whereas buildings that were 3-story and less were run under the residential software, and multifamily buildings that were 4-story more were run under the non-residential software. Now they're all together into one software, and that happens to be the non-residential software. So and that was really a judgment call by the Energy Commission, and I fully support it. Multifamily buildings in some cases also have a mixed occupancy element, meaning that they may also have non-residential spaces, non-tenant interactive spaces. These are open to the public. So those, and that was really the rationale for moving the all multifamily buildings into the non-residential area or umbrella of performance software. We've seen some changes to envelope and fenestration requirements. Again, our energy code requires that the code become more stringent every 3 years. So we've seen some changes specifically in certain climate zones. We've seen some granularity in the prescriptive window requirements, meaning that we used to have window requirements, one requirement that applied to all 16 climate zones. Now we're seeing a little bit more granularity of those requirements, which is a good thing. We need to tailor those requirements to the climate zones. We've seen some mechanical system changes. Again, prescriptive requirements for heat pump space conditioning systems, as well as heat pump water heaters, either individual water heaters or central water heaters in certain climate zones are required to be heat pumps. Now, here's where our energy code took a big step. For those multifamily buildings 4 stories and more, the 2019 code didn't have a PV system requirement. So 2022 code came in and said, now, not only do you have to meet photovoltaic or PV renewable electric generation requirements, but you'll also have to meet battery storage requirements. This also applies to our non-residential buildings. So 4-story and more and non-residential hotel motel have to meet both PV and battery system requirements. So again, taking another deep step into electrification and carbon reductions. So lastly, we again have new electric ready requirements that we talked about under the single family. Those apply to both low-rise residential as well as our high-rise residential. So any of those appliances, cooking, space heating, water heating, or clothes drying, if any of those appliances are gas, then the electric infrastructure would need to be installed for the future installation of that electric appliance. Good. Again, please let me know if you have any questions. Happy to dive a little bit deeper into some of this information here. And we'll have some Q&A time towards the end here. So getting into some of the specific PV requirements, these requirements are specific to the single family, what I'm showing you here, section 150.1 C14, but the same requirements apply to our multifamily 3-story and less. So essentially, the minimum capacity of that PV system prescriptively is set by this equation. The DC rating of the system is taking into consideration the conditioned floor area of that dwelling, as well as the number of occupants. So CFA is the floor area, and the N factor, number of dwelling units, and the occupancy of that building is taken into consideration. And really the outcome of this is to set what the minimum PV system capacity is. Our energy code sets the minimum capacity, it does not have a limit on how much PV that you can install. That's up to the utility. So Energy Code sets minimums, utility sets the maximum capacity. And by and large, those are set by our net energy metering rules, our NEM rules. You might have heard we have new net energy metering rules, NEM 3. Uh, some of these requirements have changed the amount of incentive that the utility ratepayers get for generating electricity, which is really designed to help encourage adding battery storage to our system. So, but back to our energy code requirements, there was a new exception. Again, these are all based on cost effectiveness studies. A new exception for installing PV on single family and low rise multifamily if the minimum prescriptive size of that system falls below 1.8 kW, then that building is not required to install solar. Doesn't mean they can't, it just means that they're not required to. And this really boils down to cost effectiveness. That system being so small, it's not going to pay for itself in the life cycle or the amount of time to recoup that cost. So this is a good measure, really helping save building cost for smaller dwellings. That's really what it was designed for. So good. Now, when I want to get a little bit more detail about some of our other mandatory requirements, I mentioned energy storage systems. These are all found in subchapter 7, so section 150.0, specifically 150.0 S, if you wanted to go there in the code and check it out, requires at least one of these options to be met. So either put the interconnection equipment in, right, with a minimum backed up capacity of 60 amps. So that means you're installing a battery system and all the interconnection to take advantage of it. Or you can install a dedicated raceway, which is a fancy word for conduit, from the main service panel to a sub panel that supplies branch circuits. Now, these branch circuits are listed in the following bullet: branch circuit to the refrigerator, lighting circuit near the primary egress, a sleeping room, and one other circuit of your choice. So these are primarily backup power situations. So it would save the occupant from having to install or rewire those branch circuits to meet their needs in the future. In addition to those branch circuits, minimum bus bar rating of the main service panel of 225 amps or greater, reserved space for the future isolation equipment and transfer switch within 3 feet of that main service panel, as well as all of the conduits installed for that. So really, this is paving the way for cost effectively adding a battery storage to a building without having to incur all the expense of providing that infrastructure at the time the battery is being installed. So this is another great incentive or a great requirement to pre-install all this in new homes so that the occupant at their choice can install that battery at a future period of time. Now, in addition to the battery ready requirements, I know we covered the electric ready requirements, but here's a little bit more detail. Again, once section 150.0, these are mandatory requirements. So if you install a gas water heater, you're also going to have to install the provisions or the infrastructure for the future installation of a heat pump water heater. Depending on the location of designated location of that future heat pump water heater, really determines what those requirements are as far as wiring goes and the amount of conductors and amperage that needs to be reserved in that panel. But by and large, this is just a measure to cost effectively allow the owner or occupant to change to electric technology or heat pump technology rather than be dependent upon that gas fuel source. Now, this applies to water heaters, these all are independent requirements. It's not if you install one, you have to meet all these. It's only dependent on the feature or appliances that are gas. So if you install a gas furnace, you have to provide the infrastructure for the future installation of a heat pump air handler. And that really is designed to provide the power for the heat strips. This is technology that provides supplemental electric resistance heating during those thaw cycles of a heat pump. So not sure what your understanding of heat pumps are, but they don't produce heat continuously, right? They intermittently have to go through a thaw cycle. So gas cooktops, gas dryers, again, each of these have wiring requirements. The wire conductors need to be installed, labeled. They also need to reserve the breaker locations in the main panel for those future circuits to be added. Good. Now, where are we headed with our solar PV and flexibility? I love this graph here. This really illustrates what we're talking about, load shifting, right? Or self-utilization. You can see here, our black line represent our typical daily electricity consumption. Now, this is most likely in a warmer or hotter climate zone. You can see in the morning our typical daily solar production ramps up as the sun rises and hits those PV panels. Also, you can see how our electric consumption increases in the late afternoon, largely due to increased cooling loads and where our air conditioners are coming on certain times. Now, those peak pricing periods have kind of shifted, and this is due to you know, higher temperatures we're seeing typically. You know, generally speaking, from anywhere from 3 to 4 p.m. in the afternoon upwards to 8 or 9 p.m. in the evening is when those peak pricing tariffs apply. And you can see how the PV system generation tapers off in that late afternoon, where we see a disconnect between the energy demand and the energy production. So utilizing a battery rather than off exporting that energy to the grid during that peak pricing period, you can self-utilize that energy. So by drawing from that battery rather than drawing from the grid. So this is really just a very common sense approach to taking advantage of that energy we generate on our own buildings and utilizing that rather than taxing our grid for that energy or exporting energy to the grid when it's not necessarily needed. So good. Now, some of the other programs that you might want to have an understanding of our statewide codes and standards team that are represented not only with our compliance improvement, but also our advocacy as far as reaching greater energy savings. And this is primarily done through our REACH codes. So our Energy Code ACE team, or our statewide codes and standards team, enlists other consultants like myself to provide financial analysis of features and measures that could be adopted by local jurisdictions and provide a REACH code, an above code program. So it also we have a website that is localreachcodes.com. It's a valuable tool to understand whether or not there is a REACH code in the jurisdiction where your project is located. So you can go to that website. There's a very nice interactive map and that interactive map is connected to local ordinances. So you can download the ordinance of a jurisdiction and read through that ordinance to determine what above code requirements would apply to your project. So very helpful tool, very good website to bookmark. Another great resource is the California Energy Commission. You can go to their website. I don't think a work day passes without going to their website for me. Also, to gather information about requirements or to help communicate to various stakeholders what certain requirements apply. So you can download the energy code. In fact, they have a historical record of previous energy codes, so you can download those and compare those. But by and large, go there for the current energy code. All of the documents that are used to support our energy code. So Title 24 Part 6, Building Energy Efficiency Standards, is one document. There are also other supporting documents. The reference appendices includes the joint appendices, the residential appendices, and the non-residential appendices. The Energy Commission also has compliance manuals. These are manuals designed to help folks understand and apply the energy code. I have to say we have one of the most complex energy codes in the nation. And the reason for that is because they are the most stringent in the nation. I don't think we can do much more to simplify these energy codes. So we have compliance manuals to help folks understand what the intent and purpose of some of these requirements are. So we have compliance software manuals as well as compliance forms that are available for you to download. The Energy Commission has a portion of their website dedicated to resources. So you can go to their webpage and find the resources page, and has all this information, including information on climate zones. They have an interactive tool, a map that you can type in an address and it'll tell you which climate zone your project is in. Very helpful tool, as well as lots of other helpful information like their blueprint newsletter, where the Energy Commission uses that to clarify or help interpret some of the code requirements above and beyond what the code or compliance manuals offer. So they do have a hotline. That hotline mixed results from it. I know hotline responses are taking more time, but that is staffed, and you can give them a call and ask questions. So now, I mentioned CABEC, the California Association of Building Energy Consultants. It's kind of the energy consultant association representing energy consultants here in California. Now, we're specifically about our energy code here, where energy consultants in other states may have a different focus. Our focus here in California is compliance. Some other energy consultants, dabble in other performance-based metrics, other programs, LEED, other incentive programs for that. But by and large, our energy consultants here in California primarily focus in on meeting our energy code compliance. Now, CABEC administers 2 certification programs. One being the Certified Energy Analyst. That's our highest level, or CEA is what it's also referred to it as. It's basically an exam and experience requirements that must be met to become certified as a energy analyst. Now, there are certain REACH codes that have adopted requirements to be a CEA to prepare or review compliance documentation, as well as certain incentive programs. But currently, our energy code has no requirements for energy consultants to be trained or even certified on energy code or the performance software. But we're working on that. We're hoping to increase the value of that certification and increase the knowledge and expertise of those folks doing most of the compliance work here in California. Now, along with that, we have a accreditation called the Associate Energy Analyst, or AEA. That's kind of a stepping stone, kind of similar to the engineer in training EIT situation, where maybe you don't do modeling, but you want to have demonstrated your proficiency with the code itself and understanding the compliance documentation, that could be achieved as well. So, in addition to training and certifying energy consultants, we really do focus in on education and training. That's really our core with KBEC. We do have a code of ethics. We just rewrote this code of ethics to make sure that energy consultants are honest with their analysis of buildings. It may seem odd to you why an energy consultant would cheat or lie, but it happens really to satisfy their clients' needs without having to meet all of the energy codes. So really, to become a CEA, you're going to adhere to our ethics requirements, and we take it very seriously at at KBEC. We've got a wonderful mentorship program. So for new consultants who want to become CEAs, we walk them through I think it's a 6 to 8 month mentorship program where we pair you with a mentor, where you get structured feedback, you get activities, you get training, largely through Energy Code ACE, just as a way to increase their knowledge and help them take step towards becoming trained and certified. So great learning center information at KBEC. And of course, we have a wonderful conference annually, which this year it's going to be October in Cambria. So anybody's interested, we do have some student opportunities to participate in that as well. So couple of things about Energy Code ACE. If you haven't taken an Energy Code ACE class, I highly encourage you to. That's where we take a deeper dive into these requirements. I personally teach the residential energy consultant classes, as well as the non-res and multifamily energy consultant classes. I teach some of the building inspector plans examiner classes, as well as some of the modeling classes. So if you're doing any single family residential or low-rise multifamily modeling, that would fall in one of the classes I teach. We also have some wonderful YouTube videos on our Energy Code ACE YouTube channel. So these are on-demand videos that you can watch. Might be modeling videos, that might be utilizing some of the other tools that we have available at Energy Code ACE. But those are, again, all the classes, all the resources and information that Energy Code ACE provides is always free. In fact, if you're ever in a live class, we even feed you on occasion. So a couple of tools that I wanted to highlight, Q&Ace. It's a Q&A. It's a query-based information tool where you can type a question in, and we're going to give you a knowledge-based response. A lot of or all the questions that you're going to find in the compliance manuals, we provide here searchable, as well as some of the questions that we get through Energy Code ACE that we have resolved through correspondence with the Energy Commission. So a great tool to utilize. Now, to utilize some of these tools, you're going to need to create an account at Energy Code ACE. Again, they're all free. You can go to the Energy Code ACE website, click on the little sign in icon, click on create a new account. We promise to not spam you with a bunch of unnecessary information, but we do want a little bit of information about who you are, what type of role you serve in the compliance process here. So that way we'll only send you information that's specific to your role there. So anyways, that's about it. We've got a few minutes left over for Q&A. Were there any additional questions that you might have before we wrap up for the day? I'm going to put my contact information up here. You're always welcome to reach out to me. Best way to contact me would be through email. I do spend a lot of time on the phone. And in fact, that's not my correct phone number. I apologize for that. So, right. Yeah. Any questions? Margie, you have any? I think
I'd
you.
just like to thank you again, Brian, for your amazingly clear and cogent presentation of a really complicated topic. You really astonish me with how you can break it down and make it understandable for people, because it is very complicated, but obviously very helpful as the state meets its climate goals. I think we'll just wrap up, and in doing so, I'd really like to thank SCE and especially Long Wen for his support of this program. Thanks to you, our audience, for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you might be, and also at the Architecture at Zero website. I want to remind competition entrants that the deadline for entries is really coming up. It's June 15th. And more information about the competition can be found at architectureatzero.com. Good luck to all of our entrants, and our thanks again to Brian and also to Long for putting all this together. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great day.